Digital Security and Risk Engineering team. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this morning.
So yeah, Eve and I both work in, as Ron mentioned earlier, work in the internal security team. We're working on securing Microsoft's internal assets. So DSRE, as we call it, Digital Security and Risk Engineering, is right around 4,000, just over 4,000 employees. And although there are a lot of security groups within Microsoft, we're the group who are focused on securing our corporate environments and getting our user access into the environment securely. So we'll go ahead and dive in. What we'll be covering today is initially the shift in the way we have approached security. We started this journey, the Zero Trust journey, about 4 years ago, or about 5 years ago now, 2016. And we'll talk about our shift in strategy. And then we'll go into a little bit about how we've modernized our connectivity to align with that new strategy. And we'll cover the authentication mechanisms that we're using. And then kind of finish up with just kind of some focus on the importance of user education in this new security world and this new remote work world. So with that, our shift in thought. So as many of us have probably been in the industry, the IT industry, for a number of years, we've certainly seen a shift. There was a time when we all kind of owned our network and everything was kind of closed and well managed, and everything was in our offices and in our data centers. And so security was always the boundary. We focused on network as the security boundary. But we've had to change that. We've had to adjust and think about authentication as the security boundary, because people have started working remotely and you know, the global market, as people are moving around the globe more, we really had to focus more on authentication and securing that level. One of the other big shifts was a heavy reliance on VPN, because remote work used to equate to VPN. You go sit at home and you connect your VPN, and we had all kinds of great solutions out there that we could use to help secure those connections, and that was the focus. But you know, VPN has some limits, so we've started looking at moving more to a internet-focused, front-end focused access, where people can hit things directly and not necessarily have to come over VPN. And of course, that creates some security challenges, but it also creates a number of benefits. The other big piece is devices, right? In this world, devices have changed, right? Devices rule. Everybody's on their devices all the time, so there's a lot of devices out there, and we don't always own all those corporate devices. They're not always corporate devices, and so we've looked at how do we allow people to be productive with different devices when we don't necessarily physically own those. We haven't purchased those and built those ourselves. So all this kind of led us to our Zero Trust strategy. Well, again, this all started, we started this in Microsoft right around 2016. We started building this, and what we did is we looked at it, and there were four key components that we were really focused on. The identity, and changing the way we looked at identity, really getting good security, health, and validation on our security, on our identities. And then also with devices, right? Devices are moving around, maintaining a certain level of security and trust there. And then also reevaluating our services and how we allow people to connect to those services, making sure those connections are healthy, taking those connections, putting a little more scrutiny under those individual connections to the services. And then using access so that we can kind of divide up who's going where, who can access what, and how they can access those things. And using those four components, we're able to create a least privilege architecture that allows us to kind of control those accesses a little bit more finely. So we've got these four knobs that we can start to use to fine tune connections so that we can make sure people only get into things they actually need to. But underlying all this is telemetry, right? So we have to we're constantly monitoring and iterating so that we know that we are continuing to build a strong security model. So with all that in mind, we're looking at how connectivity works today, right? With these mobile devices out there, and with desktops that may or may not be on the corporate network and may or may not have been corporately purchased, we have that Zero Trust in the middle where we're taking everything and feeding it through that. And with those four components, we can start to use stronger encryption, a stronger authentication. We create better access control, conditional access control, when people can connect to what. And we start to push some things out there to maintain a certain level of health on all these devices that we haven't necessarily built, so we can control. So we have some idea that there's some security on there, that malware is not necessarily grabbing our data and exfiltrating it off of these devices. And with the conditional access portion of it, we can start to route traffic to the right places, right? We're a heavy user of SaaS products, mostly our own products, but we do use some third-party SaaS products. We use Office Online, Microsoft 365 very heavily, right? I spend half my day using those products. But we do have a number of third-party products that various employees need to use, and we want to be able to provide that connectivity as well. And then also, we still have some on-prem stuff. The majority of Microsoft's assets have been moved to Azure. We started moving to Azure 5 years ago, and it was a big push. And we still have a few things that are on-prem. There's some legacy apps, and some things for various audit reasons that are still in the back end. But we're looking at even those, how we move those on as Azure starts to create more and more solutions for audit-ready solutions, and even meeting government and government requirements like GDPR and things like that. We're looking at even moving more of those onto the edge. And so this is the model we're now working with. So this is everything that we do within Zero Trust is allowing us to map this model, because this is the way we see the future working for the foreseeable future anyway. So we'll talk a little bit about where we started and how we got to where we are with our Zero Trust. I mean, when this all started, pre-Zero Trust, device management wasn't required because the devices were sitting on our network. They were sitting. We had some monitoring and things on our network. We had antivirus and things like that, but we didn't have management software on the devices outside of things like GPO for certain machines that are in Active Directory and things like that. And we also relied pretty heavily on single factor authentication. Everybody used a password, and we had to deal with all the typical IT challenges of password resets and people forgetting their password and the help desk that has to manage all that. But we did have some capability for enforcing strong identities. We did use some smart cards and things like that. Certainly for some of the back end gear, we used other multi-factor authentications, fobs and things like that. But that was kind of the world. It was basically centered around that network security boundary. So as we started to make this transition, the first thing we looked at was identity and how we manage identities, and we started making some changes there. We started looking at how do we force stronger authentication, stronger identity validation on our identities, and we started even going to Exchange and email, because email is a very important thing. There's a lot of secrets, a lot of information that's transported in email. It's a great reconnaissance tool. If someone gets into your Exchange server and start looking at emails, they can start to figure out where the important assets are in your environment, and they can even kind of learn how to get to them. So, making sure that we're locking down that communication channel and guarding it was very important. And also looking at more of a least privilege model. Microsoft had a pretty flat network in many ways back when I started with Microsoft. You may not have had permissions on the device, but you could get to it. And if the fact that you could get to it meant that if a bad actor got on the environment, lateral movement became a little bit easy, right? Because we weren't controlling who could go where. Even if they didn't have permissions, they could sit there and hack at it until they found permissions. And then the other thing we looked at was eliminating passwords, because passwords is a huge risk. The recent report from Verizon just came out on 2020's biggest security breaches, and the number 2 was stolen credentials, stolen passwords. So having a password is kind of risky because those can be stolen. I mean, we know we've probably all seen it at some point. Someone's written down their password and put it on a Post-it and stuck it on their monitor, or they carry it on the back of they tape it to the back of their phone, and they walk around, they set their phone face down, and their password's sitting up for anybody to walk by and see. So passwords are challenging to secure because it's hard to secure those passwords. Then from there we started working on device health and looking at how do we secure devices, and how do we make sure that there's a certain amount of health assurance on each of these devices that are connecting into the network. So we built a lot of things around the individual devices that people were carrying. With being your own devices, there's a lot of work that we had to do there because we wanted to allow people to be productive. We started looking at how data was being used and what services needed that data and whether it was being accessed appropriately. And also, as we go from a wired, on the network, everything's wired to wireless. There was a new set of components and things that we need to look at securing those traffics. Wireless is a really good target for hackers because it's everywhere, right? You don't have any physical ports that you can go cover up or watch for. You can't see when someone's got something plugged into your network that's not supposed to be. So those wireless devices and understanding the health of those became very important. Excuse me. And then the next phase we went into was the validation of access, right? Really locking in and dialing in who had access where. We have a lot of internet-only users, a lot of people coming over the internet. We've got all these unmanaged devices that are hitting us and trying to access the environment. And then, just dialing in our least privilege model, right? So taking all that together and then really starting to monitor the connections, those IP connections and things that are coming in, whether it was wired or wireless, and how those are coming in, who those were, and starting to get some validation on these connections that were coming in over the network. And then with all of that, we kind of feed into our services and how we grow our services, how we manage the health of the services, starting to have the services do more checks so that's not all on the source side, but getting that connection side validation and health check in there. So there are also some pushback, tightening up that permissioning model and how we manage that. And underlying all this, as I mentioned earlier, is just that telemetry, constantly monitoring that what's coming in, what's going out, how people are connecting things, and that helps us adjust our model as we move forward. Because as we see how things are being used, we might see that users are changing the way they're doing things, or we might see some anomalous behavior that might be indicative of a bad actor. And that leads us to COVID.
As Steve already mentioned, that in Microsoft, the Zero Trust model was put into place much before COVID-19. But during COVID-19, it was also proven that utilizing the Zero Trust model helped us to stay securely connected with our more than 160,000 employees and business partners. So with COVID, we took the opportunity to reassess our strategy. In this slide, we are sharing some of the scenarios that were used, and we found that our Zero Trust strategy worked well in this unexpected shift of work to balance our employees' productivity and the health and safety of their family. Let's talk some of the scenarios. In terms of authentication, we needed to scale up based on our increased number of people who were working from home. Employees were able to connect to the network and enroll their devices without coming to the office. That was a big plus. Our segmentation of networks supported the extra load of all the people who were working from home within US and abroad. Employees and the business guests were able to access the needed resources using their own devices, both managed and unmanaged, which proved that our network and the security models are strong and holding up well with the increased demand. Application and services are being checked using tools like Windows Defender or Windows Defender ATP just to maintain the health of all the devices that are connected to the network. So let's talk about a little bit our modernizing connectivity. In this slide, we outline a few of the mechanisms of our modern connectivity approach. Let's start with the first one, Azure App Proxy, which is a solution to publish our backend application to the user without user connecting to the customer network. And we'll talk a little bit more details in our next slide. VPN. Traditionally, VPN has been used for remote users in the past. We all have done that. However, leveraging split tunnel VPNs, we have been able to reduce the network strain on the corporate network and provided a better user experience in work from home scenarios. With the increasing use of smartphones and tablets as productivity devices, we needed a secure way to allow our users to leverage the power of these devices without compromising security. There are cases where users needed to use unmanaged devices to get work done in a secure manner. In these cases, a VDI solution like Windows Virtual Desktop provided a great ability to user without compromising the security of the corporate environment. Now let's dive into each of these connectivity type in a little bit more details. Using Azure App Proxy, as this current picture that you are seeing, it is just a simple mechanism that user authenticates through Azure App Proxy. App Proxy connects to the customer network and accesses the services and target applications for the user. Currently, there is nearly 100 apps published over Azure App Proxy, and with more being added all the time. The beauty of this solution is as Azure App Proxy is a front-facing. The user doesn't need to connect to the actual backend application, which prevents the user from accessing the backend network.
So let's talk a little bit about split tunneling and our journey there. So I'd like to start with an example of how things were for us before we went down this journey. So I believe it was right around 2006. We had a huge snowstorm here in the Seattle area where a large percentage of Microsoft's employees sit. And most of us could not get into the office. So we were all forced to work from home it was about a week. And back then, the way to work from home was VPN. And with everybody suddenly trying to VPN in, we had a lot of network congestion, connection dropping, slow transfer rates, and things like that. So it became a bottleneck. And the people that were managing it, the networking team, were all sitting at home trying to do all this remotely as well. So you can imagine some of the challenges. With split tunneling, what we've been able to do is reduce that load, because now not all traffic has to go over your network to get anywhere. So we've moved out a lot of the SaaS services, so things like Office 365 and our Azure content and things like that. We go directly to the internet. So when a user comes in and they've got that split tunnel VPN on, certain traffic will go onto our corporate network, but all that exchange, all that Teams traffic, all that goes directly over the internet. So we split that off so that we don't have to traverse our network, and it reduces the load on the network, because a lot of those applications can be a bit transfer heavy, a bit data heavy. So we've been able to reduce the strain on our network, and we continue to fine tune it, because with the split tunnel, you can start to move certain things off. So you can set up your rules of what goes local to your network and what goes directly to the internet, and kind of reduce that strain on your network. And Eva talked a little bit about bring your own devices. So obviously bring your own device is a big thing today. There was a time when companies used to buy and pay for your cell phone and pay for your cell plan because they expected you to always be available. But now cell phones and tablets are part of daily life, right? We see it when we walk down the street. People aren't even looking at each other anymore. We're all looking at our screens because there's so much information. And it's a great productivity tool, so we want to allow our users to be able to use that, but we don't want to compromise our environment. So what we've done is we've started using things like Sophos and Defender ATP to guarantee a certain level of security on these devices. So we can push down some base policies, we can secure certain things, because now I have my email on there, and as we mentioned earlier, email is a great reconnaissance tools for an attacker. So by having these tools on the devices, we can guarantee a certain level of security of that, so that we can help prevent leakage of that data. And the nice thing is these solutions work across pretty much all the platforms now. Defender ATP works on Windows, works on Apple, and iPhone, Android, and today it does work on Linux, but it's a manual install, so there's a full integration is coming. And then with Intune, we can manage all of this across those different solutions. So we are phasing away from Sophos. Sophos was an earlier solution we used, but we're more heavily using ATP and continuing to move more over to ATP as time goes on. The other solution that we implemented was VDI using Windows Virtual Desktop. So we've talked a lot about managed devices, but there are cases where people have to connect in with an unmanaged device. So some people have their home machine and they want to do work, but they don't want Microsoft managing it. They don't want Defender ATP on there. They're for whatever reason, whatever concern they may have, but they might still need to get work done. Or it might be a third-party vendor or someone like that we're allowing, a business partner that we're allowing to do some work with us, and they don't want our management software on their device because they have their own management software. So we consider those unmanaged devices for our network. But with using a VDI like Windows Virtual Desktop, these users can connect in regardless of the platform they're using. They can connect in to this VDI and do all their work. So they can get around the environment. And that way we have some controls over vendor access because we just give them the VDI access and they come in. And then we also can use this to get in and manage IoT devices that are on the network. So we have VDI solutions that are designed for the IoT management realm, and that gives us the layer of separation between the two as well. And then publishing apps and things like that as well. So, and the nice thing is, like I said, this platform works across device. So it doesn't matter if they're a Mac, a Linux, or Windows user, and we have all three at Microsoft. They can use this solution to get in. So let's talk a little bit about our modernization of authentication. We've made a huge move away from password. So Microsoft employees, by and large, don't use passwords. Many of them don't know their passwords, and there are accounts that don't even have passwords because they're smart card and require smart card and things like that. But one of the things we've started leveraging is Windows Hello for Business. And the great thing about Windows Hello for Business is that it is tied to the device. So when I set up a profile on my device to either use, use my camera to do visual recognition, or I'm using a pen, that profile is tied to that particular device. If that profile is taken off that device and used somewhere else, it doesn't work. I'd have to set up a new. So for every device I want to use Windows Hello on, I set up a new profile. And so not only does it become something I know or have, like my face or my PIN, but it's also that device itself. So that particular profile is not valid on any other device. We also support FIDO2 devices. We have smart cards and things like that in the environment. Some of our accounts we require smart cards for. Some of them, because like I said, some of them are passwordless. Some of the administrative accounts don't have passwords at all. They only have smart cards. So that only way to log in is with that smart card, and then you can use that smart card to set up your Windows Hello on a given device. But that way, there's no password that can ever be stolen or compromised for those more privileged accounts. And there's a lot of training around that and making sure people are using those properly. We also use Microsoft Authenticator for a lot of things, website authentication, things like that. And for those who aren't familiar with Windows Authenticator, it used to be called Azure Authenticator. It's an application you can run on your iPhone or Android, and it allows you to basically, whenever you hit a site, it sends a notification to your phone, and then you approve it, and then it'll tell you to select the right number. You pick that number, and it'll let you in. So that's something you have. And that gives another level of security, doesn't require a password, and very easy to use. And the interesting thing is that by going password, we've actually made ourselves more secure, but in a lot of ways, we've actually made it easier for our users because they're not having to remember passwords. It's really easy for them to stay secure. They're not having to call help desk to get a password reset because everything is something they already know or something they already are, and it makes it really easy.
As we build these models to be protected, there is still a responsibility on both the developer and the user to safekeep our network, devices, and data. So we know that infrastructure as a service offers many benefits, but it is still a monolithic mindset where platform as a service can have a more secure way of connecting to the resources and services. By leveraging PaaS, it removes many of the traditional security requirements that an IT department has to address, such as OS patching, DDoS protection, and host-based malware. With the assumed breach mentality in mind, one very important factor here is a good coding practice, which can protect against the potential damage a hacker can do. One of the good coding practices is not to store your credentials in the code. Our Microsoft developers have been trained to maintain this practice for a while. A good example for this is our recent SolarGate attack. Though we weren't a big customer of SolarWinds products, we still had some in our environment. Microsoft's own internal investigation found that the hackers were attempting to search for credentials in code. Since we have been training our developers to store credentials securely and not in code, and have built-in process to help them with this practice, the bad actors were unsuccessful in finding credentials in the code bases they were searching. That said, it's also important that we also, as an user, do our part by updating our OS and keep up with the most recent patches as they become available.
So building on that, we want to talk a little bit about education. Users are a huge attack vector, and that's a way a lot of hackers get into the environment. So as we go through this, and we want to make sure that our employees are well educated, right? We want to make sure they're trained on what the corporate policies are. We want them to have a base understanding of what the threats are in the environment and how to acknowledge them, how to notice them and report them. And there's also a lot of training around role-based training. Someone who's a developer, as Eva pointed out, we need them to know, don't store credentials in code. That's a huge risk, right? If we hadn't been training our users and really beating that in to our culture over the last 5 years, there's a good chance that when the SolarGate happened, that those hackers would have found passwords in code. We're really happy about the fact that we know that those practices worked in that case. And by the same hand, your HR department, your sales force, they don't necessarily need to know that stuff because they're never going to touch that stuff. For them, it's knowledge, it's useless knowledge. And by building good, targeted, role-based training for your users, it's easier for them to get the information they need, and they're more likely to internalize it and keep it because it's relevant to them. Microsoft over the last few years has done a lot of work internally on improving the training. The security training at Microsoft, since I've been at Microsoft, which is just, it hasn't been very long, I've only been here 20 years, but pause for laughter. Whenever you target that training to those people and make it engaging, it sticks with them a lot more. And so we found that our user education has gone up significantly as we've started to work on that. So it's a much more engaging, and it is annual. Everyone has to go through that security training every year. But training by itself is not enough. You need to go through and do awareness checks, right? One thing that really helps is sending out little reminder emails that kind of trigger on those key points, having a good culture and dialogue around what those components are of security that people need to be concerned about. So having those keywords that stick and touching back on those, whether it be through emails or posters, visual aids, just little reminders to keep it front of mind, because we get busy, everybody gets busy with their day job, and security starts to, it's easy for people to forget security, especially when they don't work in it every day like we do. Now, security is becoming a bigger thing in the world, and you hear about it in the news all the time. And so people are becoming more aware of it, but people still need those reminders. The other thing that we recommend is doing some testing, right? We do phishing campaigns. So our security team, we have a team that will periodically send out phishing emails to various groups of people. And when you get them, the idea is all of our users have been trained. When they see certain things that look suspicious, there's a button on their Outlook. They just click on report now, and it sends it over to that team. They can analyze it, and it removes it out of your email. And so they can be analyzed, and if there's a threat there, we can build better monitoring or detection in our exchange side to filter those things out. But in our phishing campaigns, obviously these are internal. We know they're there. They send them out to a group of people, and when people report it properly, they get an email a day later saying, "Hey, congratulations, you properly spotted the phishing email. Thank you for your diligence in helping protect our company. We appreciate it." Or they get one that says, "Hey, you got a phishing email the other day. Unfortunately, you didn't notice it, and you clicked on some links that would have been bad. So we've got some recommended training for you," and we go through and we do some little bit of targeted training, so we keep them up. We also, and for those of you who want to do things like that, there are sites out there that will help you build those. There's a few of them out there, and some of them, they're pretty inexpensive, and I highly recommend that once you started to train your staff on that, doing some testing. And it's not to point out who's failing, who's doing wrong. It's just a way to help bring the importance and help show them and help teach them how to help keep your environment secure, because security is all of our requirements, as Eva said. I mean, is all of our responsibility. We all have to maintain security, especially as we've moved our network out to every data center. I mean, everybody's home and coffee shop and spouse or significant others, workplaces, people move around. And then the next other thing is refreshing that material. As I mentioned, Microsoft, we do annual training. So each year when we do that training, we refresh the training as attacks and threats have changed. We update it so that it's relevant. And also, if you're watching the same one every year, it gets a little bit repetitive, especially for your employees that have been with you for a while. So rotating through that and updating that periodically is it helps keep it fresh and helps keep people engaged. So talk a little bit about the road ahead. So as we mentioned earlier, security is a process. It's an agile process, right? You have to constantly be adjusting. We've all heard the adage, security is a journey, not a destination. I'm not crazy about that adage because a journey implies that there is a destination, and with security, there never is, right? It's always changing. The landscape is continually moving, and you need to be adjusting. And so it's good to come back and check your strategy regularly and modify it. And in Microsoft, we do that. We reevaluate and we tweak as we go along. And as such, we have plans for the future, right? And just to talk about a few of them here, on our corporate network, we have IPv6 implemented, but Azure hasn't always supported. Azure's starting to bring in support for IPv6, and we're starting to play around with that and start to do some POCs of IPv6. And the reason why we want IPv6 is there's some encryption improvements there. There's also some protection there, things like SEND that help protect against cache ARP poisoning and things like that, ARP injection. So we want to be able to utilize that. And there's also other non-security benefits like just IP exhaustion in IPv4 with all these devices connecting in all the time, not having to deal with all the snatting and natting requirements that are there. So being able to just kind of clean that up. So IPv6 is something that we're really looking forward to implementing in the Azure space. Another product that we're doing a POC with now is called Azure WAN. It's a software-defined WAN or SD-WAN solution. What that does is it allows us to take so traditionally, whenever you were doing WAN, you go to your provider, AT&T or whomever, and do these point-to-point sites. But with Azure WAN, what you do is you create more of a mesh and then use software to control those connectivities and those connections. So we're using it today in our POC in some of our remote offices. We're actually taking them and moving them off of VPNs and onto Azure WAN. And so we're doing some testing there. It gives us a little bit more control over the network and things like that, so we can kind of control, we can keep those connections back to our users, back to our data centers and offices without having to create VPNs for all these remote offices. Another solution that we're starting to do proof of concepts with is Azure Sphere. And Azure Sphere is kind of an interesting one. It is kind of a private, it's kind of another cloud that's built using an MCU that we had custom built that allows us to create an environment where we can go in and register things like IoT devices. So, IoT is growing, and there's a lot of risk with IoT, a lot of potential vulnerabilities. So being able to keep those IoT devices in kind of a secured realm on a secured network that we can kind of control better access to, and also be able to monitor helps, because monitoring of IoT devices is kind of challenging. With Azure Sphere, we're able to have these devices report in, and it gives us an Azure view. Within Azure, you go in and view these devices and start to do analysis and monitoring and things across these devices. And so that's been kind of a big one for us. And we're doing some POCs with that. We're pretty excited about that one. I think there's our IoT team is, they're really excited because there's a lot of challenges with securing IoT, and this is helping them. So with that, I'd like to just kind of go over a few resources, just kind of touch on a couple things here.